Dr. Allen, welcome to Letters from a Contrarian.
Thanks for having me.
To get started, you wrote a paper that was very popular. I saw a bunch of lawyers and a bunch of other people in my circles retweet it because you had pointed out some of the flaws that were used in many COVID studies written up to this date. What got you to write the paper, and who was it intended for?
So part of it was just personal. I've been keeping notes over the last year, sort of detailed notes following things along, and they'd gotten to a point where they're quite messy and unorganized. And I thought, well, one day this is going to all be over and I'll just burn all these things. So I've done this in the past with other projects. I just decided to write them down in sort of a systematic way, just for my own record keeping. But also, I just had a number of friends and family members, non-academics, that were kind of referencing to me and asking me questions. And I thought, well, it was clear to me that they had no access to any of this stuff. And maybe I could write it in a way that they could understand. I don't know how successful I was, but that was also another thing, just to give some access to average folks to this information.
So when the pandemic first started, what were your thoughts on what was going on? And did you support the lockdowns? Did you not? And when did your thoughts start to change?
I can still remember driving home. Initially, when it broke out in Wuhan and there initially started to spread to Iran and Italy and countries like that, I honestly did not pay that much attention. I mean, other than what was just going on in the news. But I can still remember driving home from work, and the subject of locking down here first came up, or the first time that I heard about it. This was something that was seriously being considered. And my first thought was, this virus must be something like smallpox. I mean, it must be something that's so deadly to justify such a costly action. Because I recognized immediately that lockdown was going to have severe costs. But early on, there was the first mortality data that I saw was one early thing that came out of South Korea, and it showed that COVID had this natural mortality that was very, very fatal for people over 80, but literally not fatal at all for people under 40. As soon as I saw that, I drew the conclusion that, yeah, the lockdown was a serious mistake. And I also remember thinking, well, this is now a no-brainer, and we're going to get rid of lockdowns, and we're going to take some fraction of the costs that we're incurring with lockdown and use it to target nursing homes. And I remember thinking immediately about, I had a mother-in-law in a nursing home that not now, but in the last decade. And there was always this issue of people, working part-time in there and thinking, we could raise salaries there. We could pay people enough that they never had to switch places, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought that's what would happen. It obviously didn't happen, which boggled my mind. But so I made lots of mistakes, and I totally misunderstood what the infection rate was last summer. I think a lot of people made that mistake. But my position on lockdown has not changed that much over the course of the year.
And did you find that your fellow economists agreed with you on the costs of lockdowns and the severity of COVID, or did you find something else?
My experience with academics is that that they're maybe like the community at large, they're divided. That there are ones that, like me, sort of right off the bat, recognize that costs exceeded benefits. This was crazy. But there are others that are sort of the other side. They really believe that they believe two things. They believe that it's like smallpox, very deadly. And they also deeply believe in the ability of the social planner, a sort of omniscient, godlike person that exists in the state and acts as a benevolent policy planner. And so they believe that, this is somehow possible, that the state can choose the right policy and make no mistakes. But to be honest, I think the vast majority of my colleagues are somewhere in the middle. They're just too busy to really investigate matters. And so they just go along with it. Because here's another thing. For the most part, academics have borne none of the costs of lockdown. We still get paid. None of us have lost our jobs. Our wages have not been lowered. Okay, big deal. We had to go to online classes, which in some ways is easier, in some ways harder, but it's not like we're working in the coal mines. So for a lot of people, it's just, oh, I'll just keep my head down, do my own research, and carry on.
Got you. So with the paper you wrote, you pointed out 4 false assumptions that the models, the cost-benefit analyses from the beginning of the pandemic had. What were they?
So before I call them false, let's just call them critical at the moment. Okay, so these are early on in the pandemic, right? There was no data or very little data. And so we had to rely on theory and theoretical models. And when you rely on theoretical models and you're relying on a particular type of epidemiological model, that these models have assumptions. And in a nutshell, what these 4 assumptions, 3 of them had to do with measuring sort of the benefits of lockdown. One of those assumptions is what I call the high counterfactual. So you're going to say, look, if we lock down, we're going to expect a certain number of deaths, certain number of cases, infections, etc. If we don't lock down, then what's the counterfactual? What will happen? And these models are driven by not only their structure, which is very mechanical, but also by this sort of exponential growth in the virus transmission rates. And this exponential growth creates massive counterfactuals. And so one of the very early models by Ferguson and the Imperial College of London model, it's the one that came out and said, if we don't lock down by June in the United States, there'd be 2.2 million deaths. 2.2 million deaths by June is much higher than the almost 600,000 deaths that it took for 14 months. So that's one big problem. The second one turns out to be the most important problem. So a SIR model, these models are called a SIR model for susceptible, infected, recovered. You might add another S on there for reinfection or a D on there for death, but call them a SIR model. In these SIR models, they're very mechanical. And unlike an economic model, which focuses in on the fact that human beings make choices and our actions depend on the incentives that we face, in these models, human beings are like zombies or rocks. They just behave mechanically. So just like in a physics class, you can have a question where a rock falls off a cliff, and if you know the elevation, the air pressure, and the wind, etc., you might be able to predict when and how long it's going to take to land. That's how people behave in these models. They usually behave exactly the same. Every human being's exactly the same as the next human being. And they completely ignore the fact that there's a virus out there. When in the real world, of course, human beings care about the actual threats and constraints that they face. If I know that there's a virus out there and I know I'm uninfected and I know there's some chance I'm going to run into an infected person, that's going to alter my behavior. If you own a business and you know that some of your clients are going to be infected, uninfected, etc., and some will not come, they'll sue you or whatever if they get infected, you're going to change your behavior. If you're infected and you know it, you are going to change your behavior. So this turns out to be a really, really important assumption that's made. Thirdly, these models, especially now I'm going to cost-benefit models, they try to assign a dollar value to the lives that are saved or the deaths that are postponed. And they use something called the value of a statistical life, which in and of itself is fine. That's a value of life based on people's preferences, based on their utility, how much joy and satisfaction they get out of life. That's totally fine. But they usually make 2 assumptions. One, that this value of life, this value of a statistical life, is constant across ages, which we know is false. And 2, that it's enormous, that most studies assume that it's $10 million. Both those things tremendously bias the benefits of lockdown, because most people that die are old. And if you assign a value of life that's extremely high for them, you're gonna overestimate the benefits of lockdown. And then the final problem is a really sneaky one. It's so on the one hand, you're measuring the value of the benefits of lockdown by a utility measure, which I think is the right thing to do. But then when it comes to the cost of lockdown, all you do is you measure the lost goods and services from having businesses slow down or being shut down or something along those lines. So you're measuring on the, so usually what happens is they say, well, GDP fell by 5%. That'll be the cost of locking down. That ignores all of the other costs that are not measured by GDP. If a mom happened to die because of a lockdown, well, moms are not measured in GDP, and so that would not be counted as a cost of lockdown. If somebody has a mental breakdown because of lockdown, well, that's not part of GDP, and so it's not measured. If somebody's cancer appointment has been delayed by 6 months and they die of cancer because they couldn't get a screening test, that's not counted. And just, lost educational opportunity, all of these things are not counted. And if you want to see how inappropriate it is, you could turn it around and say, okay, let's measure benefits in terms of lost GDP. So when somebody dies from COVID, let's measure how much GDP we lost because of that death. Now, most of the deaths of COVID are from people over 65. People over 65, for the most part, are retired. They're not producing. They're actually net consumers. And they're savings. They're not saving, they're not producing. And so in a GDP perspective, this is sort of a social benefit that these people are dying. They're a drain on us. So would you say, oh, COVID is actually the greatest thing that ever came along because it's killing off all of these people that weren't producing anything and they were just using up their savings. If they die, we get the savings and we don't lose any production. So if you don't like that, then you certainly shouldn't like using GDP as a measure of costs. But that just shows you the apples and oranges comparison that's being used. It's very sneaky because the average person just has no that you used a dollar measure for deaths or for benefits of lockdown, and now you're using a dollar measure for costs. It looks like the same thing, but it's fundamentally not.
I'm a bit surprised that the economists who were writing these CBAs didn't include the secondary consequences of lockdowns, and they just looked at the cost of businesses closing down.
So this is one of the incredible ironies of this entire episode, is that here we're engaged in a policy, and all policy work should depend on costs and benefits. And there is a discipline out there that specializes in cost and benefits called economics. Yeah. But who's driving the policy? It's epidemiologists and mathematicians and physicists that have zero training in understanding costs and benefits. And so when you look at what economists have been writing, yeah, most of them recognize this or write about this or write about other elements. Certainly economists all write about the endogenous behavior response. But this work has just been completely ignored in the policy circles. And the government policy seems to be driven almost entirely by purely these mechanical epidemiological models that to the extent they do count costs, only count GDP loss.
Right. And okay, so if there were issues with the ICL model, which has gone really popular, why do you think governments latched onto it and used it?
That's really the million-dollar question. There are a number of theories out there. There are all kinds of political economy theories that, government bureaucrats and politicians are not godlike social planners. They're actually human beings like the rest of us, and they respond to the incentives that they face. And politicians have to be reelected. Politicians don't like to be held accountable for various things, and so, if there's an emergency, you don't want to let it go to waste. You want to use it to push your own agendas, etc. So, this could be part of it. Whatever triggered, some people think, it could be as simply explained as a decimal error in one of the initial reports that made COVID actually look like smallpox. And so that people did rationally respond, but they rationally respond to the wrong thing. So I think history is going to have to tell how did we end up down this road. Maybe it's the case that they were just major winners in lockdown. and that these people, for one reason or another, were able to convince governments to go down that road. I don't know. But what I do believe is that once we started down that road, it was inevitable that we should continue to double down on the policy. Because suppose you were a politician, suppose in British Columbia, you're John Horgan, and you entered into a lockdown in late March, early April, and then you find out by early May it was a mistake. Are you going to announce that you were part of the 30% decline in the stock market value because of a mistake? Absolutely not. You're gonna double down, right? And you're gonna hope that when this thing ends, you're gonna be able to declare that I saved everybody's life. And I think that's why the goalpost keeps changing.
Right.
You know, initially it's bending the curve. You know, then it's to reduce deaths. Then it's about hospital utilization. Then it's about variants, etc. Constantly trying to come up with another thing that we have to be saved from, because until it's all over, it can't be over.
And how did something else that you mentioned in your paper was that there are many costs to these lockdowns. How do you know that it's epidemiologists and physicists and mathematicians, but not economists, that are behind government policy at the moment? Because I feel like a standard team, I'm just imagining, a standard team for government policy would always have economists on it.
Well, I suppose, you know, if you're asking me, do I know the actual distribution of experts that governments are using? I don't know. First off, I don't want to say there aren't economists on the other side promoting lockdown. I've been emailing with a fellow from Italy who definitely is an economist, and again, he believes this is going to be, we're in the middle of something worse than the Spanish flu. So I don't want to say that there are no economists on that side. I'm just sort of going by, you know, what I observe, and what I observe in the media, what I hear on the radio, what I see on the television, what I, you know, when public health officials in Canada stand up and present what they call models, all they're presenting is the epidemiological curves. I've never heard anybody present anything on costs, and I've never seen a single government cost benefit analysis of what they're doing. In fact, just the opposite. I mean, we had a court case in British Columbia over church meetings, and Dr. Bonnie Henry made no defense of her actions. She didn't present any kind of justification that, you know, what she's doing is, you know, the benefits are greater than the costs.
Got you. And you also used a word, endogenous. What does that mean in this context?
So when I'm talking about behavior, exogenous behavior is behavior that's coming from outside of the model, and it's unchanged. Because it's outside the model, it's just unchanging. It's a parameter. So in a typical SIR model, you've got an agent in there, a human being, and there's some probability that that person will become infected. But that probability is, there is no behavior. The person's just not behaving. They're just a thing in the model. An endogenous behavior means that the agent in the model actually responds to the parameters in the model. So when a parameter changes, that person changes their behavior. So for example, suppose I'm going to go to the grocery store 3 times a week. A SIRS model might model me as just leaving my house 3 times a week, no matter what. But an economist would say the number of times that I leave the house depends on the costs and benefits of leaving the house. You raise the benefits, I'll leave more often. You raise the costs, I'll leave less often. So my behavior, the number of times I leave the house, depends. That's what you mean by endogenous.
Gotcha. So for these SIR models, what they do is they assume that the only thing that would have an effect on people's actions and behavior and choices is government lockdowns. But an economist's model would assume that people would be threatened by COVID and change their behavior just because of that.
So again, it depends on, so these models model this thing differently all the time. So, you know, there are different ways of modeling this, but one way you could model it is you just say the lockdown changes the reproduction number of the virus. So you haven't modeled the behavior at all. So in the background, you're saying, if I lock down, I know I'm going to alter your trips to the grocery store from 5 to 2. I know that I'm going to do that, but that's not in the model. In the model, all that happens is this, that change in behavior is going to change the number of times you infect other people. And so we'll just model that as a change in R, this reproduction number.
Right.
So your behavior is not actually in the model. It's just implicitly assumed that the lockdown will change your behavior, and it'll show up in this model as a change in R.
I see. Okay. You wrote about the flaws with modeling studies, and you also wrote about the efficacy of lockdown. One paper that you cited was written by Atkeson et al. And I was surprised by that because his paper, it looked like it followed the actual death rate of people dying pretty accurately. So how do we know that lockdowns don't actually work to prevent case spreading and deaths, or at least they don't have the purported efficacy as maybe public policy likes to think?
Okay, so just to back up a little bit on what you reported there. So Atkeson is this economist at UCLA, and I think he wrote a watershed paper last August. It's called 4 Stylized Facts of COVID-19. And even though the paper is quite technical and detailed, most of the technique and detail and math is in the appendix and footnotes. It's actually not that hard to read, and the results are fairly easy to understand. It's a purely statistical paper that shows, he looks at, I can't remember the number of countries now, but it's in the neighborhood of 50. He was looking at countries that had at that time experienced more than 1,000 COVID deaths. And he sort of starts the clock at when they reach 25 deaths. And then he follows the trajectory of the transmissions and the growth rates of the deaths over time. And what he finds is that the virus basically behaves the same in all of these jurisdictions. Not exactly the same, but there's a very narrow band. And essentially what happens is that after about 20 to 30 days, sort of an equilibrium it looks like an equilibrium is reached. The percentage rate of growth in deaths becomes 0. So people are dying, but it's not exploding or collapsing. And the reproduction number sort of settles at 1. So every person who's infected sort of infects another person. Kind of like what goes on, we see that sort of right now. There's 1,000 infections today, there's probably going to be 1,000 tomorrow. And he just sort of raises his hands in that paper and says, well, this has to cast some doubt on lockdown policies, because we know that the policies across these jurisdictions varies all over the place. And yet it doesn't seem to manifest in a difference of behavior. Now, he says in that paper, this could be for a number of reasons. It could be because people are endogenously responding. It could be because social networks are really complicated and complex, and we just don't understand them. And these social networks are causing this reaction. And he also says there could be just sort of biological, physical things about a virus, that this is just what a virus does. Later on, now this is the paper that you're referring on, in February of this year, he writes another paper where he takes the basic kind of SIR model, and he says, okay, I'm going to use this model to forecast what's going to happen over the next 2 years, starting from last March. And he takes that basic model, and now we've got a year's worth of data, and he's looking at deaths in the US. And he just shows how badly that model forecasts, which of course we knew already, right? The ICL model forecasted 2.2 million deaths by June. We know that didn't happen. We know it was off. And he finds that, this model is off by a factor of 12 by February of 2021. Then he just adds one thing. He adds what we call a demand curve into the model. This is just people responding. So when people see the virus is spreading a lot, the R value is over 1, they just say, okay, I'm not going to go to the grocery store today. The virus is really, there's lots of people infected and they're transmitting this virus all over the place. I'm not going to have my poker game tonight. I'm just going to stay home. And when people stay home, R starts to fall. And when R gets low, people say, well, I can go out, I can do this, I can do that, it's safe. But of course, in doing that, the R comes up. And so there's this equilibrium at 1. And when he adds, the only reason why I point that out in the paper, so whether he's right or not, I don't care. The point is that's just by adding that one thing, it shows you how important the endogenous behavior assumption is, because suddenly you're not off by a factor of 12. Suddenly you can track the movement of that virus very carefully. And you can add things like, the presence of a variant, he calls it lockdown fatigue. He adds all kinds of things in there, but that one assumption really, really made a big difference.
When I read that result, it blew my mind, because a couple of weeks ago, I was thinking that journalists and the media should stop reporting on case numbers and instead focus on hospitalization numbers, because if the goal is to flatten the curve, we should focus on hospitalization rates. And there's a negative effect of reporting case numbers, which is that citizens are judging their politicians based on how high the case numbers are. But after I read what you wrote, I'm starting to realize that another reason why that shouldn't be the case, why we should continue to report case numbers, is because people are more quickly able to respond to higher levels of COVID-19, driving people to stay home when the numbers are higher, or go out more when the numbers are lower, stuff like that.
I think it's a little more nuanced than that. So reporting case numbers makes sense if you report case numbers accurately. And so I think one huge improvement of reporting case numbers would be to, 1, report the age distribution of case numbers. It really matters to me if I'm 61 years old, if it's 60-year-olds that are getting infected, people that I'm likely to run into, or if it's 20-year-olds that are getting infected. It really matters as a social consequence whether 60 and 70-year-olds are getting infected and likely have a high chance of dying from this thing, and a higher chance of going to hospital, or 20-year-olds, who for the most part are going to be unaffected by it. So 1, case numbers should be reported, but they should be reported by age distribution. 2, it really matters where these cases are, right? I mean, it doesn't help me much if you tell me the case numbers for British Columbia. I'd like to know in my down to my neighborhood what the case numbers are, because that's what really matters, right? My response should be based on that. And this goes back to hospitals as well. We should be reporting on what is the actual capacity of hospitals. I mean, in British Columbia, I think we're around, I don't know if it's 300 or 400 cases a day, 150 ICU beds. But I mean, I believe we have 5,000 hospital beds in the province. And I believe, we have 1,000 ICU beds. I'm not quite sure, but it would be good to know. If you're going to tell me about hospitals being overrun, I'd like to know what the percentage of capacity actually is. And even that can be manipulated. And so on the one hand, yes, it's good to have numbers reported, but it's bad if they're reported improperly or in a way that misinforms me.
And going back to the first study by Atkeson, how would he know if it's more than simply correlation? How do you distinguish between human action and government action causing
that paper? He was completely unconcerned with that issue.
Oh,
so yeah, no, that's what I mean. It's a purely statistical thing. So he only just speculates in his introduction. He just says, look, I just found out, well, he finds these 4 common features of this virus. He's just saying, look, there are some statistical regularities with this virus that if you're thinking about policy, you should know. I mean, you're designing policy around a virus, and if the virus is behaving in a way that has these characteristics, you should know about them. So he in that paper, he doesn't, it's just statistical. It's in his second paper, which, it looks like he's focusing in on this endogeneity thing and saying, this endogeneity factor is really important.
Gotcha.
Now, but again, he's not proving that. He says, here's a model. if I put the endogeneity thing in, it looks like it really tracks this virus. So that should give us confidence that this thing really matters. But it's still not a test. You'd want to go out and actually conduct tests. But other people have done that. And maybe that's the question you're trying to get at.
Right. Okay. With Sweden, I guess they're a real life counterfactual that we can hopefully use in the future to test whether lockdowns have significance or not. Why did Sweden have higher death rates, Bill?
Yeah, so I mean, just to address your first point, I mean, it really does matter that we have variation. I mean, if every single country had behaved exactly the same way, and we noticed that countries that locked down still had high death rates, you'd say, well, the death rates just would have been higher had we not locked down, right? That's the endogeneity, statistical endogeneity problem. So the fact that there is variation across countries, across jurisdictions, across time, I mean, that allows us to get at what we call identification, to identify the effect of the lockdown and to identify the effect of not locking down. Now, Sweden itself is, it's kind of funny. There are lots of places that there's lots of variation across the world, but Sweden was picked out very quickly in the media and by public health people as this terrible state. If you go back and read articles about Sweden from, April, May, June, July, August last year, Sweden is just portrayed as this cautionary tale, a disaster in the making, et cetera, et cetera. People often compare Finland and Norway to Sweden. Finland and Norway had a much lower deaths than Sweden did, cumulative deaths per million. So a fellow by the name of Dan Benjamin, an economist at George Mason University, and a couple other people have looked into this. And it turns out that, there are just lots of differences between Sweden and other countries. And so lots of countries have different experiences with COVID, and these things are mostly explained by age distributions, health status, other demographics, international travel connections, number of points of entry, et cetera. And one of the big factors that explains experience with COVID, and certainly one that explained in Sweden, was what's called, it's got a terrible name, called dry tinder. And this is this idea that if you look at the 2019 flu season, if a country experienced a bad 2019 flu season like Norway and Finland, where many of their old people died of the flu, then when 2020 and COVID comes along, those people are not around for COVID to hit. And so Norway and Sweden had a bad 2019 flu experience. Sweden, for some reason, had a very light flu experience. So a lot of people that would have died in 2019 in Sweden did not, and they subsequently died in the spring of 2020. And Klein and his co-authors estimate that this can explain up to 50% of the different death rates between Sweden and the other Nordic countries. But it's turned out that the excess deaths for Sweden are not much higher than they are normally, and they're certainly consistent with the last decade, 1 or 2 decades. And the cumulative deaths per million people in Sweden is almost identical to the cumulative deaths in the European Union.
Got you. While I was reading through the paper in preparation for this, you did an OLS regression, table 2. That was one thing that I completely didn't understand. But I think what you were trying to do was measure how the stringency of a country's lockdown policies were related to the death rates. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, so I was when I wrote that report, again, it was mostly for non-academics. So when I wrote it, I thought, okay, I'm going to go through all this technical, complicated stuff that people have done. And like I say, I think, by my count, there are about 20 different studies from different fields, and we're still just talking about the benefits of lockdown here, that tried to identify the effect of lockdown using different data sets, different nations, different approaches, all these different things. About 20 studies that have come up and said, we don't find much of a difference. And to the extent there is a difference, it's probably small, and it probably only happens because of the initial light lockdown actions. heavy lockdown, nobody can find any effect. So I thought, well, after I go through all that, maybe I should go and just talk about these sort of things you can look up online in 5 minutes. Like, hey, look at the cumulative deaths in Sweden versus the EU, or look at the cumulative deaths in the EU compared to North America. They're the same. Look at the trajectory of the virus in Sweden versus the UK. Oh, it looks the same. I mean, you can sort of look up casually and find a whole bunch of examples. Look at here's Florida and California. Hey, they look kind of the same. And you say, well, but they had vastly different lockdown policies. So I was just sort of saying the reason why you can find those cases is because of what all this sophisticated empirical work. Somebody said, oh, I'm just cherry picking. And I was, right? I was just picking cases to show that, look, there are cases where it's obvious that lockdown didn't matter. So instead of to answer the cherry picking part, I said, okay, let me take the nations around the world, and we've got measures of how stringent their lockdowns were. And let me see what the correlation is between the cumulative deaths and the stringency. And if I just simply look at that, that's about as simple as I can get. Literally just look at the correlation between those two things. They're uncorrelated. And you would think that if lockdown really mattered, places that had high stringent lockdowns should have lower deaths. But that's just not true. And if you add in whether or not a country is an island or not, because that wipes out all the really low cumulative death states, it turns out you get exactly the opposite. That places with high lockdown had higher deaths. Now, of course, that's not a sophisticated test at all. It's just a response showing at the crudest level, we don't observe any lockdown effect. That's all I was trying to get at.
I see what you mean. Do you know if there's a correlation between the stringency of lockdowns and the case number?
I didn't check that.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay. So now towards the costs of lockdowns, which we haven't talked about. What are the biggest costs of lockdowns?
Yeah, so here's the thing. Costs are, it turns out, costs are much, much harder to measure than deaths, right? When somebody dies, there's a record, and we have government agencies that count deaths. We have government agencies that count cases and these sorts of things. So, you know, most of the action, especially for the first 8-9 months, was all on that side. And when it comes to the cost, it's again much, much harder to A, identify them, B, to once they're identified, to actually figure out how you would measure costs, because lots of costs are in economics, costs mean a lost value. How do I measure the lost value of something? If you were, you know, your career got put on hold, and that's going to affect your lifetime income, it's going to reduce it. Well, that's all stuff that happens in the future. You might have a pretty good idea what that's going to be, but how would I, as an economist, measure that? So, one, all we have so far are these sort of independent, literally hundreds of studies looking at specific things and saying, whoa, and then finding out that these were consequences of the lockdown. So, for example, I was just reading this morning, and we have some pretty good measures of the number of cancer screenings that were delayed because of lockdown. And we have a pretty good idea of what the future death rates are going to be from cancers, specific cancers, based on that lack of screening. So but now we have to assign a value of life for that. And I have to then add that up. And I had to add that up with the lost life years due to, you know, heart issues, lung issues, et cetera, et cetera. So on the cost side, one of the major costs is this lost healthcare. Some people, again, we don't know, but some people think this might be one of the greatest costs, is that we focused our health energy on one variable, number of cases, to the ignoring all of these other health consequences. So that's a major, major cost. Another major, major cost has been the interruption of education for the young. So these are people that, there's a big distributional issue here too, right? These are people that are not going to die from the virus, and yet their educational experience has been majorly disrupted. And so that's a huge distributional issue that's been imposed on them. We have gone into debt as a society to subsidize firms for being locked down, et cetera. But that debt will be paid in the future by these very children who are going to have their lifetime wealth being reduced because of the fact that, you know, they're less likely to graduate from high school, less likely to go to university. Their lower income profile is going to mean that their diet is going to be worse, which is going to mean that their life expectancy is lower. I mean, all of these are going to be major costs, but they're all in the future, very hard to measure. Yeah, I mean, we can go on all these kinds of things. Increase in unemployment and employment disruption, career disruption, et cetera. These are going to have major consequences.
One of the costs that I saw you mentioned was the cost of lost civil liberties. How do you measure that?
It's another issue about measurement. That one's even harder, right? That my field is institutional economics, and I sort of study the role of institutions in the generation of wealth. And institutions can be very formal, like our laws, but they can be very informal, like our social norms. And our social norms often rely on, you know, social capital and social trust. And I think one of the sad things about COVID is that we have really eroded a lot of these things. We view strangers as potential enemies and people that can kill me. And we're ingraining that. It's one thing for an old man like me to think that way, but we're ingraining 4 and 5-year-olds with these ideas that when you see somebody you don't know, you have to stay away from them and you cannot get close to them. Who knows what the consequence of that is, but I don't think it can be good. We have neighbors that turn in neighbors because they had a party or a wedding or something like that. That's an erosion of a social capital that you know, we rely on the good will of our neighbors and our fellow citizens. And so we're trying to get at all of these things. So what I do in the report, I don't know if you want to talk about this, but the way I get around all of this, I list all of these potential costs, but I can't add them up. And it's just beyond the scope of what I was interested in adding up. But I use this, what I think is an ingenious little thought experiment by Bryan Caplan at George Mason University. And the nice thing about his experiment is it gets around the problem of, oh, you missed this cost, oh, you missed that cost. And it gets around the problem of not counting the quality of life and all these kinds of things. And this thought experiment is this. Suppose 2020 had been different. Suppose 2020 had been like 2018. In 2018, we had a pandemic, but there was no big deal made about it. I'm sure at nursing homes and things, they locked things down and did all kinds of precautions, but the general population was not locked down. The general population doesn't even know that we had a pandemic in 2018. So suppose, let's call your behavior in a world where there's a pandemic, but maybe you're aware of it, maybe you're not. Suppose you are aware of it, but imagine your behavior in a world with a pandemic with no lockdown. Call that behavior Y. And now imagine your behavior this past year with COVID and with lockdown. Call that behavior X. You would get a utility. There would be some satisfaction you would have of living a life with behavior Y, even though you faced a pandemic and a virus. And there's some utility you get from living under lockdown. Now, for some people, the utility is going to be the same. I have a friend in Colorado. He's 76 years old, and he tells me, lockdown or not, he's staying home. He locked down himself. So for him, X is just equal to Y. They're exactly the same thing. For me, I just would, I would live much differently without lockdown, even though I faced the virus, right? I would live much differently. So my X and Y are different. And my utility of Y is greater than the utility of X. I do not like lockdown. So Brian's thought experiment is this: how much of your life, in terms of months, would you be willing to sacrifice to live with Y rather than to live with X? How many months of your life would you be willing to sacrifice to not have experienced lockdown this past year, but still experience the virus? My friend in Colorado would say 0. I'm not willing to give up any months. I've thought about this myself. I would easily give up 6 months of my life. Easily. For me, 6 months, no problem. I've been asking as many questions, people, as I can. And, I'm yet to have a number that's less than 2 months. Almost everybody says, yeah, I'd give up 2 months to avoid what I had to go through this year. And when I think of people that have lost their business, maybe suffered domestic violence, I know several students that are graduating with their PhD this year, there is 0 employment for them. I mean, they're in a really rough position. Man, these people would give up years maybe to have avoided what they went through. But Bryan Caplan says, let's pick a low number. Let's pick 2 months. Let's suppose that 2 months is the average number of months.
I have to interrupt you. You're saying the choice is between me giving up 2 months of my really good 2018 life to avoid this.
No, 2020. 2 months of my 2020 life to avoid lockdown. So I would have had a 10-month 2020. 2020 would have been 10 months long instead of 12. I'm saying so if 2 months is the number, you say I would rather have a 10-month 2020 without lockdowns than a 12-month 2020 with lockdowns.
Got you. Okay, that makes sense.
Okay. So now the nice thing about that's time. That's the cost is measured in time. You measured it yourself. And so you take into account the value of the lost civil liberties. You take into account the value of your lost job opportunities. You take into account your particular health circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. So it takes into account all of the things that you care about, which is all of the costs. And now here's the thing. There's 37.7 million people in Canada. So each of them, on average, we're giving up 2 months. That's 6.3 million life years. That's the cost of the lockdown. If we convert that into 80-year-olds who have about a 9.9 year life expectancy, that's the equivalent of killing 640,000 80-year-olds. Or if you want to look at 25-year-olds, that's equivalent of killing 115,000 25-year-olds. There have been roughly, what's the number in Canada for deaths? It's I knew that a minute ago. It's just escaped me.
I have Google.
I want to say 30,000, but that I think it's 20,000. But the point is, it's nothing close. It's nothing close to
25,000.
24,000. So COVID is, as let's call it, not to worry about this. COVID has killed 24,000 people, but we're thinking of doing something that's going to kill 640,000 people. I mean, how many more? Suppose we took the ridiculous ICL number of, Canada would have lost 200,000 people. That's still 1/3 of the 640,000 people that we killed anyway. I mean, when you put it in that context, you just see how ridiculous lockdown is. I mean, it's not even close.
Wouldn't that change though, depending on how vulnerable you are to COVID-19, where you'd be willing to give up fewer and fewer of your years if you believe that lockdowns, fewer and fewer months of your pre-pandemic life if you believe that lockdowns and all of these.
So remember what we're trying to do. We're trying to get us an assessment of the total cost. So we know, just like I said, my friend in Colorado, if I could, so one way I can do that, I could add up what each individual would give up. My friend in Colorado gives up 0. I give up 6 months. Somebody else gives up 1 year. Somebody else gives up 7 months. Somebody else only gives up 10 hours. We could add up all that. That would be really hard, right? Mm-hmm. So rather than adding up, we can do the next test. We can do the identical thing and say, let's take the average and multiply by n. So the average multiplied by the people is equal to the sum of all the individual estimates. So you're right. If somebody is very vulnerable, they're not willing to give up anything. But you know what? there are 10-year-olds out there who would, they're suffering a lot and they'd be willing to give up a lot. So let's add them all up because we want to consider total cost and total benefits. And so when we add them all up, we get the equivalent of 640,000 80-year-olds. That's what we sacrificed. Can you imagine if a government politician agent said, we got an idea for it's March 2020. We have a new policy coming forward. It's going to kill 640,000 80-year-olds. Would anybody in their right mind have said, yeah, let's go for that? But that's what we did.
One last question to see if I understand Caplan's model correctly. If it were the case that...
It's not really a model, it's just a thought experiment.
A thought experiment, sorry. If it were the case that it was young people who were dying from COVID-19, and it was flipped that way, that would change the numbers, the calculations, right? Because...
You mean because a young person's willing to give up even more? Or young people would be more willing to take lockdown because they're afraid of dying and their value left? Yeah, totally fine. If you change the distribution of people that are going to get killed, you're going to change the payments that people are willing to make, and you get a different number.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, if COVID was killing 10-year-olds instead of 80-year-olds, it would be a much, much different disease. And then I think you might have way more justification for locking down, because 10-year-olds are actually worth about 14 million apiece. 80-year-olds are worth about, an 80-year-old with 10 years life expectancy is only worth 2 million. An 80-year-old who's got 3 comorbidities, is on his last legs, has a value of statistical life that's actually very low. In fact, he might want to die. So it's a totally different ball game if you change who's dying.
Got you. Since you've published the paper...
I have not published the paper. I only, this is the funny thing. Again, because I had only intended for my friends and family to see it. And so I only put it on my Facebook. I only have a couple Facebook friends. Only 6 of them shared it. So I just thought, okay, well, that's the end of that. But, it got picked up by these blogs a couple days later, and it kind of went around the world a few times. But
wow.
So this is sort of an unintended, I had no plans on being on a podcast 10 days ago.
Happy to have you on. What feedback have you been receiving from the people who've read this?
So every day I've been getting probably on average 12 emails from around the world. I've gotten phone calls from politicians, phone calls from a lot of health people, a lot of mental health people. So mental psychologists with their private practices, and they're saying, and just to sum up, 99.9% of it has been extremely positive. I mean, really only one person, this economist in Italy, who happens to have a paper that says, this is smallpox and we should lock down. Aside from that one person, everybody's been just extremely positive. Now, that's probably just a selection bias in who's seen it. I'm sure there are many, many people who would disagree. Yeah, I've had a lot of psychologists, private practicing psychologists phoning me saying, thank you, because what I'm seeing in my practice is a huge increase in mental health issues. These people aren't necessarily committing suicide. They're not taking drugs, but they're just not doing well. And, that's what they see. They see this as a major cost and something that's just not being in the calculus. But, teachers, same thing. Teachers say, especially when it was online, teachers say, I have a third of my class that don't have access to an iPad or a computer. They've dropped off the map. And, that's very troubling. That's not counted in the calculus, right? And so on and on it goes. Everybody seems to have their own particular experience and cost in mind.
It sounds like learning this would bring anyone a lot of frustration. How do you cope with the incompetence in policymaking and the lack of sober thought?
I guess I was very frustrated last spring and the summer and into the fall, because I just couldn't believe what we were doing. It boggled my mind. But somewhere in the fall, there's one area where I changed my mind. There's something else going on here. I don't know what it is, but something else is going on. And so for me, I just know now, obviously, governments around the world are not making decisions for the most part, looking at costs and benefits. That governor in Florida seems to be an exception, right? He seems to be very well aware of the research. He uses the research to make policy decisions, but he seems to be a complete exception. So because I don't understand what's going on, I guess I'm less frustrated, if that makes any sense.
Gotcha.
I'm more curious about, what actually is driving. It's like back to your beginning question, why did the government do this? I don't know, but it's very puzzling.
Okay, do you think it was a result of stupidity or malevolence?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. Yeah, there's theories on both those sides out there, right? And there's there's a paper out there that I think is sort of along the right tracks, and it's sort of just saying, if you understood the institutional constraints that politicians and bureaucrats and public health people faced, then you would understand their actions. That, they might be very prone to err on the side of risk avoidance, because there's just no benefits to them to having, an increase in deaths. They can't get up there and say, oh, there's an increase in excess deaths, but it's small, it's only 1%. But we suffered that because, well, there was going to be 640,000 deaths of 80-year-olds over here. And somebody would say, where are those deaths? You'd say, well, that's just the equivalent of all the deaths that would result from lost educational. It just becomes an indefensible. In that sense, maybe the problem lies with us. Maybe as citizens, if it's one of the things that does surprise me is that as soon as you try to talk about costs and benefits, people think that this is somehow immoral. You hear this phrase, you're trading off lives for dollars, which is kind of silly. It's a false dichotomy. Dollars are just a unit of account. We're really talking about lives versus lives. And to me, that's the moral thing to do. But for a politician, it's very hard to get across nuanced and subtle ideas in a news conference.
They need to have podcasts individually with
maybe
long discussions, and that'll help a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, did you have any final thoughts before we call it an interview?
I've probably said too much already, so no.
Dr. Allen, thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was a lot of fun. Thanks.